Wherever you are, whatever you're doing, stay with us as the Suns get set to shine.
Here's Perry, to Gar-Hurd. Here's the jump shot.
Comes to Marley, a long three. He got it! He got it!
Suns, Booker for the win. Yes!
Oliver, Sir Charles, and he flies in for a wham, bam, slam. Rushed by George defensively. Booker waiting with it. He's way out on the perimeter now. Booker lobs it for Ayton. Ayton looks, goes over to Rubio. Rubio on the drive. Waits, shoots. The shot is not good. Rebound Zubac. He loses it. Suns get it back to Rubio. Time. 6 seconds left in the game. Out to Booker. 5 seconds, 4 seconds. Booker on the drive. Goes up. Here's the shot. Shoot! Booker! And the Suns win the game. Devin Booker at the buzzer puts it up and puts it in. Oh, brother!
Welcome to 7 Seconds or Less, a former podcast about the Phoenix Suns and the NBA. My name is Max McCullough, and I am joined, as always, by my former co-host, still great friend, and also is becoming still kind of a co-host, David Nash.
Yeah, it's funny hearing you say former podcast there, Max, because we've done a few of these now this season because the team is fun and continues to be fun. So it's always good to be back with you on the mics again, and the inner Suns fan in me is still a little scared of this topic of discussion that we're going to tackle today, but that doesn't mean that I'm not very excited for it because there's a lot of good conversation to have here, I think, Max.
There really is. So, David, you and I, as we just talked about, did a consistent weekly podcast on the Phoenix Suns for about a year and a half, and we talked about a lot of things.
Yep.
We talked about draft prospects. We talked about our own young players. We talked about free agency. We talked about trades. And the whole time we talked very much about a very bad basketball team, David. But throughout all that time, we never really had a chance to talk about the Phoenix Suns in the playoffs, what that would look like, what the potential playoff matchups would be. And now, David, it kind of feels like we were able to do that.
It does. And as I said, I'm a little bit scared. I don't want to jinx this here or anything, but it just feels like a natural time with the All-Star break here and jumping in and talking about, I guess, what's to come at the very end of the season and kind of being able to watch these, second half of the season games the way it's structured this year with that in mind going forward. And I think we probably both agree they need to be using the second half of the season to start, ironing out some of these things that are going to come to fruition in the playoffs. So I'm really excited to talk about that with you. And as you said, we never got a chance. I think maybe we had like a 4-game win streak or something at some point that we got to be really positive about. But that's as far as the positive overall looking forward discussion went with our old podcast. So yeah, I'm really excited to jump into this.
Yeah, and we certainly never went in depth on it like we are going to do here. We are going to rank the other playoff teams, the other expected playoff teams, in order of our most favorable matchup for the Suns to the least favorable matchup. So we're going to be talking a lot about other teams today, but all in the context of the Suns. And before we go on, David, I do want to address the jinx thing.
Yep.
I just want to promise everybody listening that what David and I say doesn't actually impact what happens to the Suns. At least there's very little evidence for it that I can see. Right now, 538, the website gives the Suns a greater than 99% chance of making the playoffs. So if that under 1% chance hits and then we don't make it because of horrible injuries or whatever, it's not because of us. It's not because of this, so please don't say that. All right, unless you have anything else to say on that, David, you can go ahead and go to the recap.
No worries. Max, believe it or not, the Phoenix Suns are currently 24-11 going into the All-Star break and 19-10 since we last recorded. We last jumped on the pod 6 games into the season when the Suns had got off to a hot 5-1 start. Like back then, when I believe Phoenix sat atop the entire NBA standings by themselves, things are still looking pretty good in that category. Max, and all the listeners out there, in fact, going into the break, our Phoenix Suns currently sit among the elite in all of the Pacific Division, the Western Conference, and even the entire NBA. The Suns will have a maximum of 37 games to play in the second half of the year, and of course will need to play the 3 games rescheduled from earlier this season against the Pacers, Warriors, and Hawks. In terms of other news, of course, Devin Booker and Chris Paul head to the All-Star game representing the Phoenix Suns at that one, and fingers crossed the Suns will have a very clean bill of health going into the second half of the season. But Max, before we get into the rest of the show now, it's been a while since we spoke in pod form, so I want you to give me some highlights from the first half of the season that we've just had here. Maybe your favourite game so far, and maybe a moment too, and I can throw a couple in there as well.
Sure. So it's a tough one, obviously. There have been a lot of really good moments. I mean, early in the season, the back-to-back Denver-Utah road wins, that was amazing.
Yeah.
But the one that my mind really turns to, and it's really because of what our star players look like in it, was that Sixers win from a couple Saturdays ago, when Chris Paul and Devin Booker really just dominated the game at the same time in the fourth quarter. And I think it's really there's been other times where they've both been good in games, but that was the first time they both were like transcendent at the exact same time. And we just really got to see what it looks like when that happens. And it was exciting, David. We
have a habit of always doing this, Max. That's exactly the game that I have written down as well. I think that one's probably etched in the memories of a lot of people listening to this one as well. I'd probably just throw in for a moment, another Devin Booker game winner in his young career so far against the Dallas Mavericks was another highlight for me. But yeah, as far as a whole game goes, just that Sixers game, and really with what we're going to talk about today with just the playoffs, that was kind of a game where I just saw the team really attack Philly. It looked like they really had planned for them. I think maybe they had a couple of days break before that game, and they kind of just dismantled them down the stretch there, and it was just beautiful to see.
Yeah, it really was. And speaking of Mr. Paul, David, and about him and Devin Booker's exploits, there's something I just have to bring up here because I've become obsessed with it.
Yep.
Since briefly touching on it a couple of weeks ago with Sam Cooper on the timeline, we briefly brought up the possibility of Chris Paul being extended. I think we all, when we first acquired 35-year-old Chris Paul, really thought of it as just a 2-year thing, right? It's just we're going to have him this season, probably next season, and that'd be that. But the way he's playing right now, if this keeps up, I mean, it's great, David, and I want him to stay around. So I really want to just kind of dive in here with you, CBA expert, on sort of the mechanics. We won't go too long into it because it's a playoff podcast, but just how we could actually keep Chris Paul a little longer.
Yeah, it's really interesting discussion, I think. Similar to you, I heard you mention that to Sam, and that kind of started me going down a bit of a rabbit hole with this as well, because, yeah, the way he's playing right now, it's like, how can we have this guy on our team for as long as possible? And, we have a long history with point guards, and a couple of them might come up here when we discuss Chris Paul. I should also give a little shout out to Shrika, our good friend on Twitter, and someone who you've met, I believe, in real life, where I haven't over the other side of the world. Funnily enough, I just asked some people for some random questions and things to talk about, knowing that I was jumping on with you, and he jumped in with Chris Paul as the topic, and kind of, what to expect for him after this contract, and what that value is, I suppose, what you would pay for that. So I think it is a really good discussion, and one worth sidetracking the podcast here for a second to talk about, because there are some options. There's probably 3 options in total, which I'm sure you've kind of done your research on, and we can go through. But basically, he's got that $44 million for next year that he can opt into and just do that, and we've got him for 1 more year, and then he becomes a free agent. But he could also opt out, and we could do a longer term contract, and he can also opt in, and we can do a longer term contract. So let's discuss it, Max. What are your thoughts on it? I'm sure you've got some.
Yeah, so real quick, I wanted to bring up one more weird CBA obstacle, which, in addition to Chris Paul's age and actually related to his age, will bar sort of a longer-term contract. And I know you're familiar with it.
Yep.
It's called the over 38 rule. Also, it's called the Chris Paul rule as a nickname, which is apt, of course. But it basically means, I will get into the arcane mechanics of it, but it means his deal has to take 3 years or shorter when he signs, I think, is what it means. So otherwise, if you add that 4th year on, they just won't count that towards the cap. They'll just make it part of the 3 years or whatever, because they just think you're trying to get around the cap and have him retire or whatever.
Yep.
So that's basically how it works. So essentially all you need to know about that, listeners, is that it means basically 3 years is what we're looking at. So of all the options, the reason why you really want to do the opt-out is because you want to get that $44 million next year number down if you can, right? Because if you can assign him to, say we do a 3-year extension, $70 million, something like that, and get that number to like $23 million instead of $44, obviously that's $21 extra million, right, to do something with. And even if you're still over the cap or whatever, it still gives you a better chance at, doing the MLEs or whatever, things that Sarver may not be willing to do if he's paying Chris Paul $44 million.
Yes.
And then the benefit for Chris Paul in that situation would be, while he's given up, $20 million in the first year, he's locking in a guaranteed $23 million 2 extra years beyond that.
Yeah, and that's really the reason that he would do it, because, right now the age is the elephant in the room, as you kind of touched on there with the over 38 rule. He's born on May 6th, I believe, about to be 36, and kind of next playoff time, if the season dates get back on track, he'll be 37 basically as the playoffs hit in kind of April, May time next year, which hopefully, the Suns are there again as well as this year. So I think that is kind of worth discussing from Chris Paul's perspective. He might want some longer term security because, the body may start to break down, and that's the risk that the Suns will need to kind of factor in as well. But I'm glad you touched on it there with the kind of whole salary thing, because right now, next year, with his $44 million, I've got the Suns at kind of around $126 million already, which is, almost $15 million over the cap. So it's not so much that we would save all the money that we kind of decrease his next year contract by him opting out and doing a new number, but the tax and all of those exceptions that you mentioned would all be available again. And everyone listening knows we got Jay Crowder with the mid-level, so we could get another Jay Crowder level player next year, as well as still having Crowder on the team as well. If they don't use the biannual this year, maybe in the buyout market, which we might get to a bit later, they'd have that available as well. And then they just have, more contracts and things to do trades and things with, and more flexibility around the tax. So I think that's the really important thing. It's not necessarily that we're going to dip really far below the salary cap number and have all that money to spend, but it is still something that both sides would really look at for, both of those reasons that we discussed. So, yeah, I'm interested there that you threw out, I think, the 70 mil number. I was kind of wrestling with this when I was thinking about it, is what is the number for Chris Paul to actually do it? Because, if he opts into 44 mil and then becomes a free agent, you would think he's going to be able to get at this level of play, even with the age, at least 20 million a year for a couple of years. So that gets up to, 64 over 2 years if he opts in. So that's where, I think where you've drawn the line there is probably around about right. It probably has to be 70 mil, 75 mil in total, I would have thought, Max.
Yeah, I think so. And the other thing you got to think about from Chris Paul's perspective is that he's already made a lot of money in his life, a lot. Yes. So, I mean, we're still talking about insane amounts of money if he goes down to $20 million a year. Obviously, it's just an absurd amount of money. So there may be part of him that's like, hey, I want to compete with this team, especially if the Suns have a really good run this year. Say we go to the Western Conference Finals or whatever. Yeah, I could really see him being like, all right, we got to add to this team. I mean, we have a real chance. Booker, Mikal, and Ayton, and Cam Johnson, the young guys are only going to get better. So we can add to this core, protect, probably maybe a backup point guard or something like that. Yeah, I could really see him being interested in doing that. The other option we should bring up, you already brought it up, but just discuss just very briefly, is just to extend him outright, which you've checked with your expert CBA sources and think we could probably do that even at a lower number than his $44 million beyond that year. The problem there is that you're still going to have to pay that full $44 million, so the incentive for the Suns to do it is a little less. But I can still see it happening, especially if Chris Paul is willing to do it sort of at a discount, right? Say he's only going to ask for $30 million over 2 years after that, or whatever it is. Yeah. Then maybe the Suns will be willing to do it just to keep him, secure his long-term thing, keep the questions of free agency away. But it's not as beneficial.
Not as beneficial, and as you say, all just would, from the Suns' perspective, would come down. Say the Suns just have an amazing playoff run here and Chris Paul is a big part of it, and they just kind of go, we don't want him on a lame duck contract next year. We want this guy on the team longer term. It's, shores up things with Devin Booker. He's making all of our young guys better. He's a positive influence on everyone. We just don't want him going anywhere. So let's kind of do something. And yeah, the example that was thrown at me was Steven Adams this year, who's on a lot more money in this last season of his old contract, and then dips down quite a lot, down to kind of 17 million or something on the extension that he was given with the Pelicans going forward. So it can be done just from a nerdy CBA kind of perspective here. It is something that the Suns would have available to them if they want to do it. And, as we've said a couple of times, it's all going to come down to how he plays the rest of this season out and hopefully the postseason, Max.
Yep, absolutely. And I do think, I guess the last point on this before we get to the playoff stuff, he's going to age pretty well, I think. I mean, he already has aged really well. He's already old. But particularly for a small point guard, it's rare to age this well. But he's just, I don't need to tell everybody listening to this. You've been watching him all year. He's just the craftiest mother effer in the history of the basketball, it feels like. He knows how to get to his spots. He doesn't rely on athleticism. He can get that jump shot off whenever he wants. It just doesn't really matter his age. I mean, he's not going to play till he's 50, but I could easily see him being a decent NBA player still when he's, John Stockton, like when he's 40.
Yeah, I'm glad you've brought this up because I was kind of thinking about it. I know you brought John Stockton up, maybe with Sam, I think, or maybe we discussed that privately. I can't remember, but I just can't. I know it's a really obvious thing, but I just can't help but think of Steve Nash. I know that they're not like exactly identical players, but Nash I think was 37 the last really good season he had with Phoenix, so that would be kind of next year Chris Paul, I suppose. And then I think the comparison there is if healthy, I think you're going to get similar production. I don't think he's going to be the type of guy, as you said, he doesn't rely on athleticism. So he's not going to be the type of guy that's still out there playing 35 minutes a night, but just at a really decreased kind of output. I think where it's going to come for Chris Paul is like it did with Steve, where basically he just can't play anymore. Like it might be his hamstrings, for instance, like with Steve, it was kind of his back. I just think if he's out there playing and healthy, you're going to get a pretty similar version to the Chris Paul that we've seen this year, which is pretty fucking amazing. And I'm enjoying watching it, Max, and I'm sure you are too, and everyone else after the point guard play that we've had over the last kind of 5 or 6 years. And then it's probably just going to hit a brick wall at some point and he just can't go anymore. So that's, I guess, the risk that the Suns will be running with this extension stuff. But as long as he's healthy, I'm all in at the moment on getting this version of Chris Paul for as long as possible. Remember
when we were talking about Isaiah Cannon as the point guard, like a year and a half ago, whatever that was? Things are different now, David.
Oh my god! Let's move on, shall we?
Let's move on. All right, so we're gonna rank the playoff teams. Before we get to that, we got to talk about the teams that are just outside of the playoffs. Although one of them I have is actually in the playoffs right now, so we're going to say apologies to them. I think you have the same. We only want to do 8, so 7 besides the Suns, just to keep it, a normal playoff thing. So we're going to exclude the Grizzlies and the Pelicans because I think everyone thinks it's unlikely for them to make it. Then we're also going to exclude the Spurs, David, even though they're the 5 seed right now. I think we just both think they're not quite as good as some of the teams behind them.
Yeah, I think it's quite harsh. The note that I've got written down here is harsh, but and maybe a little bit naive, but I just expect them to drop. You just look at all these teams we're about to talk about, and I just think they're the less talented, the less, the least amount of star power. I'd be shocked. I think this is also probably a good time to just talk about the play-in. I think we're all kind of forgetting it sometimes because it was, something that happened in the bubble and then just felt like it was going to be left with last season in the bubble, but it's a real thing to factor again here now. So, those teams, the 3 even that you just discounted there, will still be in the conversation as probably 3 or 2 of the 9 and 10 spots between those 3 when it gets to that part of the schedule right before the playoffs. So I guess at that point, Max, and this is why the NBA love it, anything could happen. One of these teams we're about to talk about could finish 7th or 8th. I mean, one of them has to. So then they could lose 2 games and be out of the playoffs. So we're a long way from the playoffs, so don't hold us to these things too much. We're just looking at right here, right now, to have a fun discussion about the Suns. So I'm comfortable removing those teams from the equation right now, Max.
Yeah, that's why I really don't want to be in the play-in, David. I don't. Even though we only have to win once, have to win twice. I don't want to run up against a red-hot Zion Williamson and the Pelicans. I just don't want to.
I'm with you.
Doesn't sound like fun.
I'm very, very much with you on that.
All right, so let's go ahead and get into this. The first point I want to make, the last point we'll make before we actually get into what we're going to do here is there's a lot of parity here, David. We both had a lot of trouble doing this. A lot of these teams are kind of similar in style and play and quality. I think it could be kind of a crazy playoffs this year.
I would make a note right here, right now. Pause the podcast, anyone listening. Go and get your phone out or get a pen and paper like I did and I like to do preparing for the pod. And before you criticize us with how we've ranked these teams, do this exercise for yourself because it is tough. and you're about to hear why, I think.
Absolutely. So I even though it's tough, I kind of saw 3 tiers here. The first one being teams I think we're better than. The next one being teams I think we're about the same as, and the next one being the teams I think are clearly better than us.
Okay, yeah.
So we'll start with my first team I have on here, and again, it's almost interchangeable with the next one, but I had Dallas first, David.
We are 1 for 1 so far, Max.
All right.
And I'll throw in here as we go through, we're 3-0 this season against Dallas, so it's not confidence that's not coming from anywhere. And as far as the rest of the schedule goes, because we're 3-0, we don't play them in the second half. So if we do see them in the playoffs, it's going to be a long time between drinks.
Yep, and not only this year, but we've just had success with them kind of in the entire Doncic Ayton era. We've beaten them pretty well, so it seems like we match up well. Luka, obviously, it's crazy. He's somebody we're rating 8th on this. But we do have guys to throw at him. Mikal does a good job on him. Crowder in the playoffs, I think, could do a good job on him when, the toughness factor. The wild card really is the Porzingis thing, right? Because if he gets his act together, we could really struggle against him, I think. Ayton has struggled against him in the past a little bit. But, all that said, I think they got worse than they were last year with Seth Curry leaving. And Josh Richardson has not worked out for them. They're just not as good as the other teams. I think Luka will drag them to the playoffs, but they seem like a first round and out to me.
You've touched on pretty much all the notes that I had down for Dallas. So probably the only other thing that is on my notes is I just don't think it's talked about enough how poorly Dallas have built around Luka.
Yep.
I'm not a huge follower of the NFL, but I know enough to know that, when you've got a rookie quarterback on a rookie contract, that's kind of pounce time because you can build an amazing team around him before you have to pay him an exorbitant amount of money. And I kind of think that is very similar with what Dallas kind of stumbled into with how productive Luka was straight away in his career. And I just think they've made bad move after bad move and mistake after mistake. And the biggest one you just mentioned there, which could come back to bite us if he gets healthy towards the end of the playoffs and they might look a lot better, but it's Porzingis. Kind of everything hinges on him in terms of how dangerous they could be in the playoffs because, the note that I've got here is exactly what you said. We defend Luka pretty well already. He gets his numbers, but he seems to be less impactful against the Suns than kind of normally. And then just nobody else gets involved. Like it's just all Luka's numbers and nothing else. And if they're not hitting shots off his passes with great consistency, we seem to just be able to manage them, which is crazy to say and crazy to think about with this team. But it was even before this year. We just seem to have the wood over him, and with the star power that we've got now, I'd probably be even more confident if nothing changes drastically between now and a potential first round matchup, Max.
I agree. Yeah, we're just better than them. We're so much more deep, We just have better players than them as it comes down to it. The way we lose that series is Luka just is the best player in the series by far and wins it himself. But for all the reasons we just mentioned, it's unlikely to happen against this particular roster.
Here's a question for you, Max, because I know, and we're going to do this a lot. We're going to be, typical Suns fans thinking about how we can stop the other team, and all about us playing up to our potential to beat others. But who the fuck is guarding Devin Booker and Chris Paul in a matchup like that?
Yeah, no one. They're just going to have to hope that one of those guys or both are just not shooting well, right? That's all it comes down to. I mean, you're not going to guard those guys with that roster, I don't think. We'll get into it. A lot of these rosters are going to struggle with that, I think. That's why it's really good to have 2 all-star guards, David.
Yes, it is.
All right, I'll go to my next team. I'll be interested to see if you have this team here, too. This is the only 2 teams I have in this tier, which is the tier of teams I think we're definitely better than. I have the Golden State Warriors here, David.
We're 2 for 2, Max.
Alrighty. So, obviously here you're scared to death of Steph Curry, right? So, Steph Curry could beat us by himself in a series, no doubt. But otherwise, we're just more talented than them across the board, right?
Yeah, and we haven't played them yet. At the time of recording this podcast, a little peek behind the curtain here. The game of the first half of the season is still unplayed, so we'll either be 1-0 or 0-1 against the Warriors. So we've got 2 games, I guess, to kind of test some of the things we're about to talk about here in March and in May before the end of the season. So that's going to be really interesting to look through that lens. I'm just looking forward to the second half of the season, and I'm sure everyone will hear it in these conversations, because some of these games are going to be mouth-watering now that we're thinking about potentially playing these teams in the playoffs. But you hit the nail on the head there with Steph. It's like kind of like Dallas in a way, and I think you've grouped it really well with those two in this kind of first tier. It's like, all right, you've got a game plan for an incredibly hot Steph Curry, who's playing very, very well right now, but I'm just not that scared of them elsewhere. One thing that does scare me though, Max, is they're 18th on offense right now and 4th on defense, and that's really scary, because I feel like the offense can only go up if they can work out some other things around Steph, and I don't think he's dropping off if he stays healthy. So they could be a really dangerous team for anyone to face come playoff time, and that's probably the main thing that stands out to me. But as you say, you plan to stop Steph Curry. You can probably, try and exploit, say, Andrew Wiggins and Kelly Oubre. We're familiar with one of those guys in particular, and poor shooting overall and bad decision makers. So, you just really overplay Steph and make him give the ball up and make some of those other guys beat you. And I think you'd put yourself in a pretty good spot in a 7-game series. So I don't know, what other thoughts do you have on the Warriors, Max?
Yeah, no, I'm glad you brought up the defense thing. I saw that the other day and I was kind of flummoxed by it. And in fact, I think they've been the number one defense over the last 15 games or something like that. And I don't know why. I need to watch some more or something, because I don't really get it theoretically why they'd be that good on defense. I know Draymond's awesome.
Yep.
Sev is a really good defensive guard, way underrated on that end. But, Kelly's inconsistent. We've seen enough of him. Wiggins, too. I have to see that more. It's really interesting. But, yeah, I think you hit the nail on the head with Steph Curry. I think what you're trying to do in this series is just get the ball out of his hands as much as possible. I think, Mikal is very useful here. I think he'd be guarding Steph most of the time.
Yep.
I'd be imagining. And obviously be throwing doubles on him and stuff, because, like you said, they don't really have a secondary guy. I mean, they have guys who can do some things, like Kelly. We've seen he gets hot, he can shoot sometimes when he's streaky. But Draymond can pass, but he can't score at all. I mean, Draymond has games now where he scores 0 points.
Yeah.
So there's that, and they just don't have that second guy. I think that's why I'm not scared of them. If Clay were healthy, obviously it'd be a whole different conversation. Or if they pull off some major trade and get a second guard who's a little terrifying, it kind of changes the calculus. But it just feels like a team that's going to be all Steph and nothing else on offense, and be a little easy to defend.
Yeah, I had a topic to discuss here, and it's probably going to be relevant to a lot of these teams. I had it down to make sure we talk about it, but we may as well talk about it kind of right here, right now, Max, with this team. And that's the defense that we've seen from DeAndre Ayton recently. And I don't know about you, I've seen a shift. I think everyone's been commenting on kind of how bad it is, but I actually think that there's reason for kind of optimism with what they're doing here. I'm seeing Ayton play up on the level of the screen a lot more recently. We saw it in the Brooklyn game. He got obviously burnt by James Harden. Mm-hmm. We saw it against Charlotte even, with LaMelo Ball getting past him a bit. And then in Chicago, he was a little bit better against Levine and Kobe White. But my theory here, Max, is this is actually Monty and the Suns looking towards the playoffs, because Steph Curry, there's going to be guys we're going to mention later. We already mentioned Luka. You need Ayton up at the point of the screen so a guy like Steph doesn't burn you from 3 consistently. And I think the weakness to that is either a guy that can blow by DeAndre like we've seen, or if you're kind of playing 2 guys up on the level of the screen, Steph passes to the next guy, and then you've kind of got to over-rotate, and teams can kind of pick you apart there. But we talked about it with the Warriors. You want the ball out of Steph's hands. So if you come up to the level of the screen, kill his 3-point shot, and make him give it off to the next guy, I'd be pretty confident, at least in a Warriors series, that that's actually a pretty sound defensive scheme, because you're going to make the other guys kind of make decisions, or as you say, make Draymond Green become a scorer, which he just isn't. It's totally incapable of doing anymore.
Yeah, no, it's a really interesting point, and it's something that Sam actually brought up when we talked to him a couple weeks ago. That a lot of people criticizing what happened in the Brooklyn game. I was among them. I thought it wasn't the right strategy to win that particular game. But if you are trying to look towards the playoffs and get Ayton comfortable doing that, that does make sense to me. And I agree with you. It definitely worked against Chicago. And I think Golden State is a good time to bring this up, because I think it is a team that would work against them too. It wouldn't work against a team like Brooklyn fully strength, right? Because there's too many perimeter guys who can do things. And I don't know that there's any teams in the West. I have to think about it. I haven't, on top of my head, I can't think if there's anybody in the West who this qualifies with. But I think from against at least most of the teams, it's a defensive strategy that makes sense. So if that's what Monty's looking at right now, I think I approve of it. I guess.
Yeah, he needs the reps. And what I kind of equated it to was like what we're seeing now from DeAndre is kind of what we saw with more traditional like drop coverage in year one, where he looked pretty kind of out of place, and now we can see him in year 3, and I think everyone agrees his defense at least in that coverage is some of the best in the league. So if they can get him to being more comfortable in that, he might be a lot more effective than what we've seen in these first couple of games. So again, something to watch for the second half of the season there, I think, Max.
Yeah, actually, it's going to be really relevant to my next team, so I want to use that as a segue. If you're ready to go to the next tier, for me at least.
I think we're ready to go. Before you do, I did ask for some questions before we jumped on, and I just want to give a general shout out. It was very funny. You and I had a laugh about it, Max. We'd planned to do the playoffs episode. I randomly asked for questions, and lo and behold, we got a lot of playoffs questions. So I think we've timed this really well. Everyone's got it on their mind. So we're not going to address specifically, but B-Red, C-Red, Muhammad, Christian Coker, Devin Barkley, and Chris Captain all threw us questions with just general playoff vibes, and I think that we'll probably do a pretty good job of answering all of those indirectly in the next hour and a half or so, Max.
Yeah, I bet so. Okay, so again, this is a tier jump for me. This next team is going to be a curveball. I know I have this team lower than probably you and almost everybody would have. I have the Utah Jazz next, David.
We've broken our streak, but not by as much as maybe you would have thought. I think we're kind of on a similar wavelength here. I would say we're 1-0 against them so far, and therefore, again, we've got both games in April coming up in the second half of the season. But I'm going to give you the floor here because you're maybe at least a little bit stronger than I am. So tell us why, Max, please.
So first of all, I view these two teams as very similar.
Okay.
Right? They're built around two similar guards, kind of an old wily veteran guard and a young scoring star guard. They both have two very important bigs they rely on, or one each, Ayton and Gobert. Gobert's obviously much better than Ayton. But again, what we were talking about earlier, the segue I wanted to make was Ayton's movement skills could translate to the playoffs a little better.
Yep.
Gobert doesn't have the feet that Ayton has out in the perimeter, and he's been played off the floor in the playoffs before. Gobert has, and I think maybe that's where Ayton could shine. We'll see. And then to continue my comparison to the team, like the rest of the team is kind of similar too, right? A couple of good wings. You got Mikal and Cam Johnson. You got Ingles and Bogdanovich on the Utah side. I just feel like these two teams, when you see them in the playoffs, they're kind of trying to do the same thing against each other.
Yep.
And at the end of the day, I think it's more likely that the team with the better guards will win. And I just trust Chris Paul and Devin Booker more than I trust the Utah's guys.
This is why I love discussing these things with you, Max, because I think we sometimes disagree, but we have pretty similar views on things. And you've kind of just rattled off all of the notes that I had down for the Utah Jazz. I think you're clearly a little bit stronger on it than I am. I'm just scared more than anything. They're currently the 4th best offense in the NBA and the 2nd best defense, which is just crazy to me, that the Utah Jazz, but no surprise, they're sitting at the top of the standing, so it's clearly translating. But I love your Gobert-Ayton comparison. I think back in the preseason when I wrote about DeAndre Ayton for my newsletter, I still think this. I think Gobert is the best current NBA comparison for what you want Ayton to be doing. But the way that I mention it, maybe to not get people too angry at me, is that it's kind of Gobert 2.0, where he does have a little bit better offense that he can give you, got good touch around the rim, quicker feet than Gobert. So, it may be a better version of him in the long run if you get the most out of DeAndre Ayton. So I just love that you brought that point up. I've had written down, we match up fairly well, and you hit on that there. We're kind of very, very similar teams in the way that we're constructed, and that would be really interesting to watch in a 7-game playoff series. But ultimately, I do kind of feel the same way that you do, even though they're just on a tear right now. And you brought it up there. I kind of feel like Ayton would be Gobert would be the most exploitable in this matchup. And what I had written down was mid-range. Chris Paul, Devin Booker. He's going to want to be at the rim, and the Suns are going to be bombing away from 3. And if you think about playoff basketball, all the space is going to be in that mid-range, and we've got two of the best mid-range killers in the league. And I think if we're looking ahead, and we may discuss this before an actual playoff series between these two teams, but I think that's what everyone is going to be talking about. Can they drag Gobert, out into the mid-range and then open up things behind him? And I think that is the real tantalizing topic of this series for me, and what I would just love to see, Max.
Yeah, I agree with all of that. And I think the last thing I want to touch on with this particular team is the benches. I think the benches are maybe the one area where Utah may have an advantage, even though I really like the Suns bench.
Yep. Jordan
Clarkson terrifies me. He's been having an insanely good season so far. And I wonder, I'd be interested to get your thoughts on this. Do you think, does that, when you think about a potential Utah-Phoenix series, you think when those bench units are out there and Clarkson's kind of going off, do you think we need to upgrade our backup guards at all to have somebody who, we can put out there and feel good about it?
Yeah, I had written down Clarkson maybe highlights the need for the Suns to have a third guard, because, you look at Utah's numbers and he just comes off the bench and continues the production of Donovan Mitchell, basically, in terms of scoring at least, and I think that can be really handy to have. I'll give a couple of shout-outs here. Mike Notham said, what trade deadline moves could the Suns make? A lot of guys, Serge, King Cactus, and Lev, all asked for, buyout options. What would you use the last roster spot on? And what I had down in the Utah section, which I thought was a great question from Addy here, was, can you talk about which players will get the most minutes and the least minutes? And I think in the playoffs, that is. And I think this Jazz series is kind of a perfect one to just quickly talk about that, Max, because, you would see probably, an 8-man rotation. We don't really know with Monty. We know he likes to play a lot of guys, but we haven't seen him coach at least the Suns in the playoffs. So it's a little bit of an unknown and kind of fascinating to talk about. But
right.
I do think, and we might get into talking about staggering Chris Paul and Devin Booker in a bit, but that does minimize, to readdress your question, I do think that minimizes just a little bit the need for a Jordan Clarkson on this team if you kind of staggered fully Booker and Chris Paul. But to all of those people's questions, I know a lot of people talk about backup bigs, and I think it's necessary. I would be targeting a third guard if that was kind of a move that the Suns were looking to make, because if one guy goes down or you just need that scoring punch off the bench, I do think it is still a weakness, Max.
You'd also want somebody that you can trust, and I think I'm very happy with the way Campaign has been this season, but you can't totally expect him to bring it in a playoff series at all. You just can't expect that. I mean, I hope so, but you can't expect it.
It would be a bonus, basically.
It would be a bonus, right? Ejuan Moore is a veteran. He's good, but he's just not, he's not a playmaker. He's not the guy you just have the ball in your hands and just make stuff happen, right? He's just a smart player who's more of an off-ball guy.
Yeah.
We brought up his name before, and I think he was heavily discussed in free agency and such. But, somebody like George Hill would just be a whole different world to have on this team. You could stagger Booker and Paul and have them with Hill at almost all times.
Yep.
And that you just feel way more confident with that, because that's what Utah's probably going to do, right? You're probably going to see almost at all times you're going to have Mitchell, Conley, and Clarkson, 2 of the 3 of those guys out there, right? Probably almost always.
Exactly.
And so you want to be able to match that, and a guy like George Hill would be somebody you can do with that. I don't know what OKC is looking for with him, but buyout guys, that's not the kind of guy you get through buyout very often. That's more backup bigs and such. You don't really usually get a guard like that, right?
Yeah, he would have to kind of, OKC would have to really fall away from the playoffs, and he would really have to be the one who pushes that to get out of there, essentially. And then, we are in a good spot if it did happen with having the biannual exception, which is kind of like $3.5 million that they could offer him when other teams can probably only offer him minimum spots and, clear rotation minutes as well, instead of going to, say, the Clippers or Lakers where he may not play very much or at all in certain series. But let's talk about it quickly. Say you go and get a guy like George Hill and you're in this Jazz matchup. You've got Ayton, Crowder, Bridges, Booker, Chris Paul. Then you got George Hill, Saric, Cam Johnson off the bench. There's 8 guys. I don't know if I'm missing anyone that I really shouldn't be missing out of the Suns rotation. There's obviously Campaign, Ejuan Moore you mentioned, Frank Kaminsky, but I'm talking about when you push comes to shove, maybe a second round matchup against the Jazz, you just want to play 8 guys that you can trust, and that's pretty solid. And you've got a guard, a wing, and a big off the bench to kind of cover all bases there. I'd be pretty confident in a Jazz series with an 8-man rotation like that, Max.
Yeah, no, I agree. Again, I think we could lose to any of these teams, honestly. As we mentioned, anybody can kind of lose to anybody in this thing.
Yeah.
But that's just I feel confident going into it. I think we'd have a better 50% chance to win it. The variable, of course, being that maybe in the summer the COVID stuff just gone and, the Jazz fans are just rowdy as hell. It's a real home court advantage. That's tough. But I mean, it makes you look at the current standings, and I just want to freeze them. I just want to freeze them where they are, because we would have the Spurs in the first round, who we didn't even deign to put in this, and then we'd play Utah second round. I just feel like that's definitely our best path to a Western Conference Finals, especially if we can upgrade the roster in the way we're talking about.
We're owed a dream run, Max. Come on, like after all the shit we've put through, like just give us easy first round win, and then a favorable matchup in the second round. But as you say, as we get into this tier more, there's no favorable matchups or easy wins or easy outs, really. I think that's the exciting thing. The Suns are going to be up to their eyeballs in pretty much all of these matchups, at least in my opinion, right here, right now, except for maybe some of the LA teams that we'll get to much later in the pod. But all these tiers of teams right in the middle here, that's the exciting things. That the Suns deserve to be in the conversation with these teams. And as you talk about the X's and O's and rotations versus rotations, it's becoming pretty clear to me that they're here for a reason, and that's why we're comfortable talking about it right now. Like, they deserve to be in this conversation, and that's really exciting.
Yeah, I mean, they've opened up a little bit of a gap in the standing, so it's between the 5 seeds, so that's nice. I mean, right now the expectation should be home court advantage in the first round of the playoffs. I think anything else than that is kind of a disappointment. Real quick before we move on, David, I'd be interested to know, where did you have Utah?
Next. So I think you alluded to it before. I think I know the team you're going to bring up next. I'd be shocked if it was the other 3 on my list. So I think we've just flipped 3 and 4 basically. So we're not too far off.
No, I think that sounds right. Yeah, I have the Portland Trailblazers next. I think right now they don't seem all that dangerous because they've been hurt. They went on that little streak when Dame was going crazy with the injuries, but then now they come back down to earth. But they are going to get healthy at some point, right? I mean, there's no reason to believe CJ McCollum or Nurkic would miss the playoffs. And there are some matchup problems for us here. Again, 2 very good guards here with these two guys. You got it also, CJ McCollum has already shown in the playoffs that he can kind of do the thing where he takes over because of the mid-range game. And then a healthy Nurkic is somebody who really worries me with Ayton. David, how do you see that?
Yeah, 1-0 against them so far, but as you said, we played a depleted team. Second half of the schedule, we've got them once in March, which I think will still be without CJ and Nurkic, but we play them quite late on May 13, so that'll be really interesting because you would hope that both of those guys are back for that game and we can get a bit of a stronger sense of how we match up with Portland at their strongest. But I guess on that, right now, Max, they are 7th on offense and 28th on defense. I think CJ and Nurkic aren't going to help that defense number too much, I wouldn't have thought. I guess they could always get even more efficient on offense, but I think 7th is probably about right. And the reason they're there right now is what you just mentioned, Dame just going on an absolute tear at the moment, leading that team to win. So I am pretty comfortable with them. I know it's really basic analysis here, but where I kind of look at it is like CP3 and Booker are kind of marginally better, if not the same, as a healthy Lillard CJ combo. And then if you just look at down the rest of the rotation, I just think Phoenix just covers them in pretty much every spot, other than maybe center with a really healthy Nurkic, as you said, maybe taking advantage of a inexperienced Ayton in his first playoff series or something like that. But that's kind of where it comes down to for me. But I share similar sentiment to you of just being shit scared of Damian Lillard in a playoff series, Max.
Yeah, that's basically what it comes down to for me. I mean, all the other parts are important and interesting to talk about, but Damian Lillard is just terrifying. And he can be taken out of the game in later rounds of the playoffs, as we've seen by certain teams. I don't view the Suns as one of those teams. I mean, we would certainly try. I think we'd have Mikal, I'm sure. Again, the answer to a lot of these problems is going to be Mikal Bridges, I think. So we'll try, but no one in the league's stopping Dame, not even Mikal. So if he's doing one of those things where he's decided he's going to score 40 points or more in multiple games in a row, then we're going to be at the mercy of that. I do think Nurkic will help the defense a little bit more than maybe you would given it credit for, just because right now they got nobody, right? It's a disaster.
Yeah, Kanter, which is basically nobody.
Exactly, it might be better.
that famous
Go at him, yeah.
famous quote by Devin Booker, pick and roll at 0-0 every time. But I think he wears maybe 11 now with the Blazers, so Booker would have to change that to pick and roll at 11 every time. Although, is Melo 0-0? So yeah, the quote probably still stands, pick and roll at 0-0 every time. But that's basically their starting front court at the moment, which is why right here, right now, we would be very confident at a playoff series with them. But we did get a couple of questions from JDU32 and also Force Master around this topic. I alluded to it before, and I do think this is the series. I mean, it's kind of relevant to all the series, Max, but I do think this is the one where it's kind of the best point to bring it up. And that's the staggering. You're going to have Dame playing crazy minutes for Portland, I would imagine, and you're going to need one of Devin Booker or Chris Paul out there at all times. Do we agree on that when the playoffs come?
Yeah, I think so, especially if the roster doesn't change at all and we don't get somebody like George Hill, then yeah, I think so.
Yeah, and I think the early results are good on that. I think the Suns look really good when Devin Booker's running, point book essentially with, and at the moment it's like an Etuan Moore or something. As you said, if it was like point book with a George Hill off ball, I think the Suns look even better than what they have so far. But I think, everything shortens in the playoffs, and I would be, I guess this is me saying right here, right now, I'd be very disappointed in Monty if, not probably the first game of the first playoff series, we're not seeing kind of that stagger with Book and Paul, because you can't muck around in the playoffs, Max.
No, you really can't. And the one thing they got to be worried about, though, we knock on every piece of wood ever, we haven't seen it yet, is the Chris Paul injury that has happened in the playoffs in the past.
Yep.
Chris Paul might be an NBA champion right now if he didn't get hurt in the Western Conference Finals against the Warriors a few years ago. So that's got to be in the back of their minds. Like I totally agree with you. If you want to win the game, you got to stagger the guys, and CP3's minutes are probably going to start creeping up there, especially in game 6s and 7s to the 38, 39 mark. But you just got to be careful with it, man. If he blows out that hamstring, you're done.
Yeah, and that's where the George Hill type discussion becomes even more important, because let's say, God forbid it doesn't happen, but let's say there is a small hamstring strain, but it happens like towards the end of a series and we get through, and then he's got a bit of a break before the next one or something. Starting George Hill with Devin Booker sounds a hell of a lot better to me than starting campaign with Devin Booker in a playoff series right now. So that third guard may not even be so much about playing all three guys heavy minutes in the playoffs. It might just be that little bit of insurance that they need to get these guys through. Yep,
totally true. When people think about injuries in the playoffs, they usually think about, he's out for the whole thing or out for a series. Sometimes guys miss one game, right? It can happen. And having somebody like George Hill step in, I think is a good point by you. It would be really, really, really helpful.
You mentioned it there with Chris Paul. It was just one game at the worst possible time, and he lost his chance, at least so far, to win a title. Maybe, fingers crossed, that can become a reality with the Phoenix Suns. That would be amazing.
Wouldn't that be, David? Wouldn't that be? All right, I have one more team in this tier, but maybe before we go to them, we can do Did You Know, David?
All right, Max. I can't let you get away without a Did You Know segment, even if we aren't doing the pod as often anymore. So with the All-Star teams recently announced, and this episode being all about the playoffs, I just had to go digging back through the Phoenix archives. So Max, did you know Devin Booker and Chris Paul became the 16th Suns teammates to be named All-Stars together in the same year? And this is, of course, where you get your first test. For you and the listeners at home, how many of the previous combinations can you name, Max?
Wow. 16 combos, huh, David? Okay. So
let's put it this way. I've thrown a big question at you here, but at least you're going to get some right. I'm not expecting all 16 from you.
That's a great point. So Nash and Shaq, I believe, was the last one to happen.
You've started off with a...
No, maybe the last one.
You've actually started off with a loss here. Nash and Shaq were never
really?
never all-stars together. Shaq's one, but you're thinking it's another teammate with Shaq.
Oh, wow. Okay. I guess Amari?
Yep. Amari and Shaq, 08-09.
Okay, Nash and Amari.
Nash and Amari did it twice, 07 and 09.
Now... wasn't there a year where the three of them with Marion all made it, or was it just Nash and Marion? Oh, was it just Nash and Marion the year that Amari missed the whole year?
Well, you've covered 2 off there. Marion and Nash, the year that Amari missed, 05-06. And the triple combo you mentioned did it twice in 04 and 06, Max.
Okay, Barkley and KJ, obviously.
Yep, 93-94.
Now, before Barkley got there, was there like a Marley and KJ?
No, but there was the other combo that you've just mentioned there.
Oh, Marley and Barkley?
Marley and Barkley did it twice, and the first combo to do it non-consecutively. They did it in 92 and in 94.
Okay. All right, that's enough. I'm gonna let you go with the rest of them, David.
You did pretty well. You've pretty much covered off the entire modern era there, which I think is very impressive. I know I put you on the spot with these, but let's go all the way back to the start. So Gail Goodrich and Dick Van Arsdale, 68-69. Connie Hawkins dragged several teammates along with him. He did it first with Dick Van Arsdale twice in 69 and in 70. Then he did it with Paul Silas in 71, and then again with Charlie Scott in 72. Walter Davis and Paul Westfall, 77, 78, and 79. They were the first combo to do it 3 times together, obviously. Then we get our first triple combo, Walter Davis, Truck Robinson, and Dennis Johnson in 80-81. Tom Chambers and Kevin Johnson did it twice, 89 and 90. Jeff Hornacek and Dan Marley in 91-92, which I would never have got. And I think we have covered off everyone there, all the way down to Shaq and Stoudemire, as you said, in 08-09. But Max, for the rest of Did You Know this time around, I want to focus on a particular year the Suns had dual All-Stars, the 04-05 NBA season. The season prior, the Suns only won 29 games, but Mike D'Antoni joined the team halfway through the season. As we know, the current Suns won 34 games last year in Monty Williams' first season with the Suns. They had young versions of Stoudemire, Barbosa, and Joe Johnson, plus guys in their mid-20s like Marion and Marbury, but they weren't very good yet. The current team has Booker, Ayton, McHale, and Cam Johnson all in those age ranges. Then, that off-season, the Suns made a splash, signing a guy you might remember who went by the name of Steve Nash. They also made an underrated move for Quinton Richardson, one of the 4 highest-paid guys on that team. For this season's teams, Max, that is obviously the one and only Chris Paul and signing of Jay Crowder. But Max, I've been light on you so far, so second test of the segment coming at you right here. How many games did the 04-05 Suns win that season?
62 games, David.
Correct. I don't think we're going to quite get there with this team, particularly with the shortened season, but that team went on to sweep the Grizzlies, take care of Dallas 4-2, and then lose in disappointing fashion to the Spurs. That one game to 4, I believe that series was. But I don't know about you, Max. I'd take a gentleman's sweep in the conference finals with this team, given where we have come from. Now, there's one glaring difference in the comparison I just drew and the topics being covered. The 04-05 Phoenix Suns had 3 All-Stars, not 2. Nash, Marion, and Stoudemire, as we said before, one of only 2 combos to do it in the purple and orange in the past. Heads up in advance, Max. I'm not going to do it to you now, but there'll be a couple of questions in 7 seconds or less in regards to this topic and having 3 All-Stars both this season and next. But for now, I will leave you and the listeners with this to end the segment for this episode until we return again someday. One of those 04-05 All-Stars, Sean Marion, famously was included in the Shaq trade. Shaq then was sent to Cleveland, and his legacy ended with 2 guys he was traded for, Sasha Pavlovich and Ben Wallace, both getting waived by the Suns. The second round pick became Dwayne Collins, and he was also waived by the Suns. The second guy was Stoudemire. I forgot he was also traded to the Knicks. I thought he left in free agency, but they did a deal, Max, and that's where his legacy ended too, because the pick that they got was a second rounder, and it never actually came. I think it was one of those fake top 55 protected ones, Max. So that leaves Steve Nash, who was first traded by the Suns in 98 for the pick that became Sean Marion, and after returning, he was traded again to the Lakers for a bunch of picks. The best of those picks was used to trade for Brandon Knight, before trading back for it in 2018 and landing none other than Mikal Bridges on this current Suns team. So Max, not only did we get the point guard this offseason, but the Suns' other point guard legacy still lives on with this team in the form of Mikal Bridges. But speaking of the Lakers, I think we should jump back in here and talk about the rest of the best of in the West. And I think you said there's one more team before we get to the LA teams here, Max.
I already knew that thing, obviously, about the Brandon Knight pick ended up becoming Mikal Bridges, but every time I hear it, it just surprises me again. It's so ridiculous.
It is. I think we may have even mentioned it before in a Did You Know, but I had to bring it back for a second special time, Max.
You could bring it up every single time, and it would be amazing every single time. All right, yeah. So as you've mentioned, there's one more team before the LA teams. I think we both are going to have them. I think everybody would consider this team to be below the LA teams. I do think some people may think that the Denver Nuggets, who we're obviously talking about, would be actually a little more favorable to us. I think I can see people making the argument that Ayton plays well against them, plays well against Jokic. I would counter that by saying that Jamal Murray murders us every single time we play him, and he also murders everybody in the playoffs as well. And when it comes down to it with Denver Nuggets, there's just so much playoff experience with them over the last 2 years that they've gained. I think Jokic he's having a really underrated season, David. I think people are acknowledging how good he is, but not quite how good he's been.
Yep.
Like he's, to me, like a very legitimate MVP candidate, especially if Denver starts winning more games. They got to fix their defense, whatever's going on with that. But he's just ridiculous at this point. He's, by my money, the best center in the league, not named Embiid, and those two are close. So that's what it comes down to for me. It's just he's just so damn good.
I've got a grin on my face, Max, for probably two reasons.
Yeah.
One being, I thought I was kind of being a little bit spicy with this take, putting them in the top tier, and you've totally just kind of gone and said, no, David, it's a perfectly normal take, and here's why. And then you've gone and rattled off, again, most of the notes that I had. Probably most notably, I think Jokic is the MVP right now with the way he's playing, and that's why, or at least the number one reason that I would be totally scared. That and the fact that, as you mentioned, Jamal Murray basically plays like an MVP when he plays the Suns. So, we'd be coming up against two MVP caliber players if we got the Nuggets. An interesting wrinkle here, we are 1-2 against them, so I guess it's not that spicy because of all these teams we've spoken about so far. We don't have a great record this season against the Nuggets, and that also means we don't play them again, Max. So again, if we cop them in the playoffs, first round, second round, wherever it may be, we're going to have to look all the way back to, essentially that back-to-back, I think, that we had against them. Or maybe there was a day in between, but essentially where we played them twice in Denver in 3 days or whatever it was. And that's going to feel like a long, long time ago by the time the playoffs roll around.
Yeah, it really will. I do have to point out, because I know there's got at least one listener screaming at their iPod right now. iPod, I'm 100 years old. iPhone right now. They're screaming like, Jamal Murray traveled. So, whatever. We'll call it even on the series. How about that for the season?
I don't think I'm going to get over you saying iPod.
I don't know why that popped in my mind. I've never even owned an iPod, David, so I don't know where that one came from. But here, so I think the other thing that makes me nervous about Denver is that I expect them to go on a run. And I think it's very possible they could be our first round matchup in the 5 seed. And you don't really want to play in Denver. It's a notoriously hard place to play because of the altitude and such. So that part's not great. We would likely have home court advantage against them, I think, which helps. But overall, it's just for the reason we mentioned. It's not my favorite matchup. I do think I still have them in the tier of teams that are about the same as us. That could change, I think, if they get their shit together a little bit more. The other variable is somebody that neither of us really liked that much in the draft, David. Back when we were doing the draft so closely, it was Michael Porter Jr.
Yeah.
He's had a sort of a weird season so far, but the talent with him is obvious, right? And if he puts it together, Denver could launch right to the moon.
Yeah, I totally agree with what you've said there. I guess the one interesting thing that maybe we're possibly underrating and overrating Denver here is they're 5th on offense and 21st on defense. And we haven't touched on the Suns' ratings in these metrics as I've been going through and mentioning all the other teams, but the Suns are one of very few teams. I think right now it's basically just Utah, and it was the Lakers before AD went out and they dropped off a cliff offensively, that has a top 10 offensive and defensive rating. And looking at these teams, again, trying to be the positive Suns fan, it's a very unnatural thing for me to do, but any of these teams that I look at that are below league average on defense, I'm kind of licking my lips going like, that's our place to exploit here. Like we're going to be able to hold up on defense and just exploit the hell out of this team defensively on their end. And that's kind of something I think that I would watch in a series like this. As dangerous as they are offensively, I do think we'd be able to really attack them in that area. So just wanted to bring that up. But yeah, it all comes down to Phoenix probably game planning and stopping one of those two guys that we mentioned, and then, you know, hopefully that kind of neutralizes the rest of the role players. You know, if you maybe let Jokic go off, for instance, but you manage to keep Murray in check and just kind of cut down Jokic's assist numbers and maybe turn him into a scorer, Max. I don't know how you feel about that, but that's probably how I would approach a series against the Nuggets, and just kind of kill off all those secondary guys that you just rattled off there, and really try and make them beat you in other ways. What do you think?
I totally agree with you. It's kind of what the teams used to do in the playoffs against Steve Nash. Like, they knew he didn't really want to score, right? And he did prove them wrong a couple times. There was one against Dallas, I remember, back in the day where he scored like 48 points or whatever it was.
Yep.
So you could do it, and I think Jokic can do it too, but it's not natural to him. He wants to be the offensive anchor who's, you know, making plays for everybody else. So I do agree with you. I think letting Jokic sort of, you know, kind of forcing him to score and not close off his passing stuff is probably the best way to beat him. But that said, though, I mean, you can't let him just go hog wild. And that's why I think it's such an important series for Ayton. That's in any series that we're going to talk about today, it's probably the only one where he is the most important player on a team for sure. He has to have a good series, or we're not beating him, I don't think. Because, you know, he's shown he can kind of neutralize Jokic a little bit. He can at least, you know, no one totally neutralizes him, but he can actually pose problems for him around the rim and such. And if he's able to do that, because I think you know, if you're forcing Jokic to take a bunch of jump shots, great. But if, you know, Jokic is just getting into the paint and spinning around and scoring from 3 feet over and over and over and over, that whole strategy is not going to work. But, you know, Ayton's the guy who could stop that. So I think that, you know, it'd be a really interesting series just because we could really feel very differently about DeAndre Ayton either way, depending on how it goes.
I think that's a really great point by you, because I think looking at most of these series, the role that I see Ayton play is just defensively, kind of in most of you just kind of hope that he can take care of his matchup defensively, and we probably won't be expecting too much out of him offensively. And if you kind of combine your point and then what I was talking about, exploiting them defensively, I think this could be a really, really key series for a guy like DeAndre Ayton, because, as you said, you just want him to make it, make life as tough as possible on Jokic offensively, and kind of make him hit jumpers and not have a bunch of turnaround 3-footers, because that's where he becomes really dangerous. But then on the other end, like, run him ragged. Like, I don't think it's any secret that, you know, those 2 games against Denver were in that 4-game sample size of Ayton's that we saw him just be a completely different player, and that's why it's so frustrating seeing him kind of regress back to what he's been more recently. But, you know, there were 2 games in that 4 games that were both against Denver, and that's what he did to Jokic. You know, Jokic kind of still got his numbers, but he made him work really hard, and then on the other end, he punished him, like, constantly. He was running up the court, getting up the court sooner than Jokic every time, just really dominating around the offensive boards and getting stuff back in. And that's where you can exploit Jokic, because, you know, he can't jump over a jam tin. So you've got to be able to kind of hit the glass.
Wait, jump over a what?
A jam tin, which, you know, is what you guys call jelly, basically. You can't jump over, you know, a credit card is probably what I should have said.
You eat it out of tins over there down under?
We don't, actually, which makes the saying even more ridiculous. But there's my iPod comment for the pod. But this would be a fascinating. I would be scared as hell, and I think I've said that a few times already this podcast. So key hint to everyone listening at home: if the Suns make the playoffs, I'm going to be scared as hell, no matter who we play in the first round. And none of us are match fit to the nerves that are going to come pre-playoff games, because I don't know about you, I still get nervous against just big games in fucking March, Max. So I don't know how I'm going to feel, how sick I'm going to be before playoff games, but that anxiety will be kind of matched with the excitement here. But I know you touched on this topic a lot with Sam on the Timeline pod when you did it, so I don't want to make you go over old ground too much, but Suns Fan UK asked about it. It's been on my mind for an eternity now. I do think this is the type of series where this discussion becomes really important, and that's the Crowder versus Frank Kaminsky stuff that the Suns are doing at the moment, and Monty seems to basically play it on matchups. We don't know, Crowder's recently gone back in, but it still doesn't look great. I'd like to give him time with it, not expect Crowder to look great with the starters just in one game out of nowhere, and then when he doesn't, kind of pull it again. But, what's your thoughts? You did give a lot of thoughts on that pod with Sam, so I don't want to make you go over it too much. But, looking through, I guess, the prism of this series, how do you feel?
It's a really interesting question. I think one of my answers would be that I think both are going to be very important, because I think there's a good chance that Ayton gets into foul trouble in a couple of these games because Jokic is just so smart.
Mm-hmm.
Jokic is going to Jokic is going to know everything that we know, right? That Ayton's the key to the series. If he gets him off the floor, he's just going to run a ram shot over whoever is behind him. That's a bit of a cop out to say both are important, but I do think, another thing about Denver is it's a team that has a lot of experience over the past 2 years, and you're going to have to counter that with some experience of your own. With Jay Crowder, that's why the signing was so good.
Yep.
For this kind of thing. It's also a team that you can be tougher than, I think.
Yep.
I'm not calling Denver soft or anything like that, but we'll get to the LA teams in a second. They're not that. So Crowder's somebody who I think could really kind of, I don't say take over the game really, because he's not that good of a player, but set a tone maybe is a good way to put it in a series against Denver. So I think it's going to be really important to have him out there. I also think, I don't want to belittle Frank. I do enough of that already. But this is the series that when I look at it, I'm kind of like, all right, this is where I think in the buyout market we got to find another athletic big. Because, in the event that Ayton gets into foul trouble, I really don't want Kaminsky to be the next best thing against Jokic. I don't feel that is a pretty good option. So, maybe here's a good place to get into real quickly, maybe a buyout or trade for a backup big. I don't know if you have any questions about that.
Yeah, I think that two great points, and let's talk about that because I think it's definitely worthwhile, and this is probably the one. But you mentioned it at the top there. Every series, particularly this Denver one, with the way that the Suns are currently constructed, every team is going to go at Ayton and try and get 2 early fouls on him because it is going to throw the Suns completely out of everything that they want to do. And if they don't have another athletic big that they can plug in, they're going to be panic stations, 5 minutes into the game, and we're just not going to see the Suns that we want to see play the rest of the game out because they're just going to be on the fly trying to make things work. So I think that this is the perfect time to discuss, a buyout big or a backup big. But before that, I would just also throw in the reason that I really advocate for getting Crowder into the starting lineup now is kind of for 2 reasons. We need the reps, and that team or that starting lineup needs to gel. It clearly didn't gel at the start of the season, but I think that was more to do with the fact that, Booker and Paul weren't gelling. Now they are a lot better and have a lot of chemistry together. So you've got to throw Crowder in there and get him, starting to be familiar with that lineup and what role he plays. So it isn't just when you need Crowder in the first round matchup and you throw him in the starters and he hasn't started for like 30 games, and that's just a nightmare that I don't want to have to watch. So that I think would be a mistake. The other thing is I'm very much open to the fact that Crowder might not be the guy.
Right.
And I think we're about a month away from the trade deadline. So play him now for like 10, 15 games, and if it's becoming very apparent that he's not the guy to be the starting 4. The only thing that I'm sold on is it ain't Frank. Like, if we're starting Frank Kaminsky at power forward in the first round matchup, I am just going to be like not hopeful that we're going to win that series. So I'm not necessarily saying it has to be Crowder, but I think he on the current roster is the guy who has the best chance. But find out now whether it's just not going to work, and then maybe make a move using Crowder or using someone else to get your starting power forward. Because, as I said, I'm convinced it isn't Frank. I'm more than happy for Frank to be on this team, but in a third big role that he's much better played in. I was going to say quite frankly and stop myself. I should have just gone with it. But let's talk about it. Backup big. There's one roster spot at the moment after we released Damian Jones. They had to recall Jalen Smith the other day because Dario was out. That's going to be a constant theme because they are so thin. What can they do, Max?
It's a great question. You have to see what's on the backup market. We know DeMarcus Cousins is going to be there. That's a no from me, dog. He's not going to fit into the role we need, right? This is a guy who may not play in certain games.
Correct.
That's the kind of role this is going to be. Maybe he gets to a 4 to 5 minute role in every game, but I think that's even unlikely because of there's not a lot of room for that. The guy that really sticks out to me, just real quick, the guy that really sticks out to me is JaVale McGee, David.
Okay. Yep. I like that.
Because he played with the Lakers last year. He was fine in that role. I just think he's somebody who could do it again.
Yeah. Just to round back to Boogie, I think you've hit the nail on the head. I mean, his play style isn't conducive to what the Suns team do either, but you have to look through the reason why, or at least why it was reported that he got bought out by the Rockets, and because they wanted to go in a different direction and he wasn't going to get minutes.
Yeah.
So, as you say, this guy isn't going to play in a lot of games for the Phoenix Suns, so why the hell would he be happy to come to the Suns and play no minutes at the same time? I guess you could argue because they're going to make the playoffs and potentially be a contender, but if he wants to do that, he'll just go to the Lakers or something and be the backup, break glass in case of emergency big there. I like JaVale. I do think that he's a guy who has shown on a good team that he's happy to sit there and not play. I think when you think about this role and say DeAndre getting in foul trouble, or worse, potentially DeAndre just playing one of those games where he's clearly not engaged and isn't impacting the team in any way, shape or form, you want a guy that can basically be, the basic fundamentals of what we ask from DeAndre Ayton night in and night out. And I think JaVale would basically tick those boxes. It's run from rim to rim, protect the rim, finish lobs, set screens, all those basic things that we expect from Ayton night in, night out. But some nights he just doesn't have it and it's frustrating. And yeah, I think having a guy like JaVale is basically who we should be targeting with that roster spot and with a buyout. And we mentioned it before with George Hill, the Suns are in a good position with that little bit of extra money to play with than some of these other teams to convince someone to come to the Suns, Max.
Yeah, no, absolutely. The other guy I guess we should mention because he's in the media a lot is Drummond. I mean, it would be great if Drummond was willing to come play this role, but he won't be.
Correct.
He's going to want to play a lot more than that. And if he were willing to play a role like that, it's similar to what you said with Boogie. He'd just go to the Nets or the Lakers or something.
Yeah.
He wouldn't come to our team.
What?
So I think we can probably rule him out.
Yeah. One guy that I would put like a 7% chance on right now, and what they're doing with Frank in the starting lineup, if there's any way, shape or form that Blake Griffin gets bought out.
Yeah.
I would happily take him on the Suns, and I think I've always been a Blake fan. I know he looks just washed right now, but if I had his injury history, I would also look washed on the Detroit Pistons, because if he does have one last spurt in him, why the hell would he waste it on the Detroit Pistons of all teams?
Right.
And I just think, I don't want to get into a huge conversation about it now, but there's other reasons why Monty is playing Frank Kaminsky in the starting power forward role. I'll just say that and leave it at that. And I think Blake Griffin would do all of those things better than Frank Kaminsky can.
It's a really interesting idea. I mean, obviously your mind goes right to the CP3 Blake Griffin thing, right, from the Clippers,
Yeah.
obviously. I think they ended on fine terms. I don't think that was a problem between those two, as I recall. I think it was more DeAndre Jordan.
Yeah.
I mean, and again, Blake Griffin's also somebody you could see. I mean, he's made so much money in his career. He knows that he's not the same player anymore. He seems more likely to me to sort of embrace a smaller role and maybe be the token start for the Suns. Exactly what you said, the Frank Kaminsky thing, where he starts the halves but doesn't usually finish and ends up playing 18 minutes, or whatever.
Exactly.
I agree with you. I think it's worth a look, especially if he's willing to come on the biannual. It's not expensive. I mean, why not? Worst case scenario, he doesn't play and just goes to your bench, and he's a pretty, I think he's a pretty favorable bench guy. I think most people like him, right? He's funny and stuff. So I would be in on that too, for sure.
It's just, as I said, probably less than 7% chance, because it's hard to see him get bought out now with that contract, and the Suns or any team basically are definitely not trading for him, which
right.
I guess then goes anti what I just said, because they've basically committed to sitting him until he's off the team. So if no one's going to trade for him, they probably have to look at a buyout. So yeah, I just think that with the things that they like to get out of that starting unit, and you mentioned it there, that it's basically a token start, and Blake Griffin is your token starter, like, yes please.
Yes, please. And what if we just, now we're about to go to the LA teams, right? And I have the Clippers next, And I'm just thinking, what if we got to the Western Conference Finals against the Clippers and started Chris Paul and Blake Griffin against them? Could you imagine?
Let's dig into that for a second. So that Clippers team, DeAndre Jordan was the center, right? So there's your 8 in comparison.
Mm-hmm.
JJ Redick was the starting shooting guard.
Mm-hmm.
Devin Booker has a little bit of JJ in him, but obviously a much more rounded offensive game. But, there's the comparison.
Sure.
And who was the starting small forward?
Oh, God, I can't remember. I think they went through I think it was one of those things where there was like a revolving circus.
Yeah,
guys, right?
I mean, Matt Barnes would have been in one of those seasons. Yeah.
He played at least 1 year, yeah.
Mikal Bridges would be that guy. Yeah, that's interesting. I like it. But let's talk about the current Clippers, Max.
Okay, so again, this is another tier jump for me. So we left teams behind where I think that we're about the same, and now we're at the teams that I think are clearly better than us.
Yep.
Not that we can't beat them, it would just be an upset. And it's almost 2 tiers for me, because I think that the next team we're going to talk about, everyone knows who it is already, it's the Lakers, I think is actually a tier above this team even for me.
What a spoiler. What a spoiler.
I know, what a spoiler. This team, I mean, first problem is obvious, right? They might have the 2 best players in the series, in Kawhi and Paul George.
Yep.
The way Paul George is playing this season, I know he's had his struggles in the playoffs, and I think he was Pandemic P last year, they were calling him. The Clippers didn't want to be there in the bubble last year. That was pretty obvious to anybody watching.
Yep.
That will not be a problem this year. I don't think they're going to do a bubble. So Kawhi and George, I mean, obviously they could just win the series by themselves, no doubt. I mean, Kawhi can win the series by himself, no doubt. He can, as he showed us in the Toronto run, he can be the best player in the NBA for a stretch, no doubt. The thing I like about this team, though, is that I think the rest of the guys are not as good as even maybe they were last year. I think they do kind of lack some depth, and I think we could exploit them, particularly when the benches are playing. I'm sure they would stagger Kawhi and George for sure. And I think we, again, not to harp too much on this, but I think we struggle against Kawhi largely because Mikal, his one weakness right now is his weakness. I guess what you'd say, he's not as strong as you'd like, and I think Kawhi could kind of bully him a little bit.
Yeah, I'm with you on that. The Clippers are 3rd on offense and 14th on defense right now. There was a report the other day that Ty Lue might be holding back some of their defensive scheme stuff, which I always find funny. I think those types of reports tend to come out when teams aren't quite as good at one thing that they probably should be. I think they should probably be better than 14th, given they've got Paul George and Kawhi Leonard on their team, 2 of the best wing defenders in the league. Right. But we are 0-1 against the Clippers so far and have 2 games coming up in the start and end of April, so they'll be really interesting to watch. But I think you've touched on it there. I went straight to okay, we know who Kawhi and Paul George are, and I'll throw a question at you in a minute in regards to those 2. But I went, where's the weaknesses? What are we exploiting? Right now, I think it's point guard for them, and there have been some reports that they kind of want to address that on the trade market because they know that was particularly something that came back to bite them in the playoffs last year, just kind of that secondary playmaking outside of Paul George and Kawhi. And then big depth. So again, another series where you'd like Ayton to really be a force down low against Zubac, or if they go with, say, Serge Ibaka, to Ayton to kind of neutralize him and make sure that he's not on the offensive glass and kind of blocking shots at the rim and make himself dangerous there. So they were kind of the 2, I guess, places that I looked at. But, when you get to this top tier or probably the last 2 or 3 teams that we're going to talk about here, I think you are really clutching at straws because they're really, really good teams, and we would have to be at our absolute best and neutralize some of these things. But that's, the fascinating thing to look at. But the question, who do you throw Mikal at? And then who do you guard the other person with?
It's a really good question. I do real quickly just want to point out that you said they may be looking for a guard. There's a lot of rumors that Kawhi called Chris Paul in the offseason, wanted to get Chris Paul in. It just didn't work with all the money, but that's definitely definitely what they've been looking at. I agree with you there. So I think I put Mikal on Paul George, and I just kind of guard Kawhi with everybody else. Does that make sense? Sort of like a team effort on Kawhi? Because I don't think Kawhi is a very good matchup for Mikal. I think he'll bully him too much. And Paul George is not a good matchup for anybody, but he's better for Mikal than I think Kawhi is. And for Kawhi, I think you just try to double him, keep the ball out of his hand, stuff like that.
Yeah, I think that's the answer at the end of the day. And again, Jay Crowder, everyone, that's why he should be playing in these playoff series, because he's not going to neutralize Kawhi, but he's going to make things pretty damn tough for him. And then if he can funnel him towards Ayton, as you said, it'll be a group collective. One thing that I wanted to touch on, I think what you said is the right first option, for instance, but I wanted to bring this point up, and I think it covers most of the series, but this one's maybe where it's the most relevant, and I think it happened in the game that we played against them. Mikal was guarding Kawhi and doing a pretty good job in most circumstances, and then Paul George was the one that, I don't know if you remember, like his first half was just ridiculous. His whole game really was ridiculous, but in crunch, when everyone else was getting killed, including Devin Booker, Chris Paul put his hand up and said, I'm going to guard Paul George for the last 5 possessions. And obviously he's tiny. He couldn't contest Paul George's spot. But as far as this is what I've really appreciated watching Chris Paul outside of, absolutely everything else that he does on the basketball court, Max. He knows guys' games, and he was pushing Paul George off his spot. He was making Paul George catch the ball, 2 feet further away from where he wanted to catch it. He was just being an absolute nuisance. I don't think we've really talked about Chris Paul's defense very much in the Suns' Twitter sphere because his offense has just been so fun to watch. But I think the playoffs, whether it's Clippers, anyone else, that's where teams, or fans, I should say, of the team are going to really see how smart and how good of a defensive player Chris Paul is, because he takes those challenges on, and even though he lacks so many things compared to the guy that he's guarding, he's just an absolute menace, Max.
I'm so glad you brought that up. I mean, every single team Chris Paul goes to just immediately becomes a good defensive team. Not an accident, right?
Yep.
Honestly, he probably should. I haven't gone through all the players yet for this. I don't know if I ever will, but for the all-defensive teams, I mean, I think he probably has an argument to be on the second team, right? I have to imagine he does.
Yeah.
But the problem is a lot of it doesn't show up in the stats. Some of it does. I mean, he gets a lot of steals, but part of it is just the way he has the whole team playing defense. He really is like the floor general on defense, I think.
Yep.
And it's so important. And I love your point about him guarding Paul George and other big guys. I think part of the, a bad matchup's a bad matchup, right? When you have somebody way smaller than you on you, you're going to try to punish them or whatever. But with some guys, I think Booker's this way, unfortunately. They just kind of give up. They try to get their arms up and they try to, I guess, kind of get in the way. But ultimately, they're just going to get scored on, and they're not taking that 20% chance that they have to possibly stop them and using it well. But Chris Paul is, if there's a way for it to happen, Chris Paul will find it. Right? Even if he's way overmatched size-wise or whatever, he's going to every once in a while just poke the ball away, because he's thinking in that way. He's thinking, listen, I only have one shot at defending this. I'm going to go after it. And he's smart enough to do that. And I think it's a really good point by you is that, I don't think we're going to have it be a consistent thing to have Chris Paul guarding one of these guys. But in the context of a team defense where everyone's, revolving around, just having him out there will help us, turn 3 possessions that would have been a 2-point basket into a turnover or whatever.
Yep, 100%. There was a recent game we just watched against the Chicago Bulls where Wendell Carter got switched on to Chris Paul, and Chris Paul was yelling at DeAndre Ayton to get back and switch. And it didn't happen. Ayton was stuck out on the 3-point line. Ball goes to Wendell Carter, pretty much under the bucket, Max. All he had to do was turn around and put it in over Chris Paul, who was not going to block the shot, obviously. He catches the ball. As he goes to turn around, Chris Paul pokes up through the gap in his arm, pokes the ball out, transition, other end, Suns score. And I just went, clearly you don't want Chris Paul guarding Wendell Carter Jr. every possession down. I have enough faith in DeAndre Ayton to be a good defender in that matchup. But I just thought, in that one possession in isolation, if Ayton had to try and scramble back to switch and they didn't time it properly, it was just going to be a bucket for Wendell Carter. So It was almost the better result in the end that they didn't switch and Chris Paul just did his thing that you just talked about he always does and just poked the ball away just in one possession, and we scored at the other end. And I just had a wry smile on my face because that was the encapsulation of the challenge that guy takes on pretty much in every matchup that he comes up against because of how tiny he is.
I'd love to see him teach Booker to do some of that stuff, because it's not something you have to be athletically gifted to do at all.
No, not at all.
It's just you got to try.
Yep.
Booker, I think that's the biggest problem, not to get in a Booker tangent here. I do think he's played better defense this season than in past seasons for sure, no doubt. One thing I don't like about him, though, and it's he doesn't try to go for things like steals in transition. After a missed bucket.
Yeah.
He's not. It doesn't work every single time. Usually it doesn't work, but every once in a while, if you just run after the guy won't be paying attention, and you'll steal the ball, right? Booker needs to start doing more of that stuff. I hope that's something that Chris Paul gets in his ear about. Okay, are you ready, David? Are you ready to go to the Juggernaut?
Let's go to the Juggernaut. Hopefully we can re-release this episode before the Suns versus Lakers Western Conference Finals and say these are our thoughts on the matchup, Max.
Yeah, more hopefully it's the Suns versus Clippers Western Conference Finals. But yes, I'll take any matchup. But I think everybody would agree with this. I don't think this is controversial. The Lakers, if healthy, and that is looking like maybe a bit of an if this season. If healthy, I don't think we're beating them. I don't think anybody's beating them. Just because LeBron and Davis, when they're both healthy and on their games, they're so overwhelming physically and talent wise. There's not much you can do about it, David.
Yep, we are 1-0 against the Lakers in the first half of the schedule, and then we have one game in March where I would imagine Davis is probably still missing, and then another late one in May where he will probably, I guess, hopefully for the Lakers, be back. I don't know how I feel about it for the Suns. I don't really want to wish ill health on anyone. But yeah, I think the first question that I wrote down, which is almost a rhetorical question, is how do you guard LeBron and Anthony Davis, Max?
You don't. That's the answer to that question is you don't. And that's what everybody showed in the playoffs last year. Nobody did. It's too much, man. They're too physically imposing. They're too talented. Davis can shoot from 27 feet, and he's 7 feet tall and dominates defensively around the rim and rebounding wise. LeBron, even at age, I think he's 36. Doesn't matter. He still looks amazing. He's as good as he's ever been. I was actually listening to the Zach Lowe and Bill Simmons talk about the most unstoppable players into the game, who you want, just trying to get you a bucket.
Yep.
And they both said LeBron's number one, and it's right because he's just so good at everything, man. He's just so good at everything, and even if Davis isn't healthy, you're still not going into a series against the Lakers and thinking you're definitely going to win. As long as that guy, LeBron James, is on the other side, they always have a chance. And with Davis, it almost feels unbeatable.
Yep, they're 17th on offense right now because it kind of fell off a cliff when Davis went out, but still first on defense, which is just so scary to think about. But, for 2 seasons now, then their championship, definitely, that was their calling card, defense. And then they've got the clutch performers on offense when they need it, and that's just what makes them an impossible task. I don't want to, I guess, cheap out here, Max, and not talk about any kind of scheming or X's and O's stuff about where they can be exploited, because I think, we owe it. It's what we've done for all the teams. But before we do that, I think the more interesting conversation right now, at least for fans, and you kind of alluded to it, is seeding. Because while AD's out, they're falling down the standings. And you mentioned it before, all things going well, the Suns are probably going to have home court and be around that 4th seed. What are the chances, and it's not even just a Suns question, I think everyone would be shit scared of this, that they fall to 3, 4, or possibly even 5, Max, with the longer and longer that Anthony Davis is out? And how scary is that for the Suns and some of the other Western Conference teams?
Well, I think 4 is actually really possible, which is a credit to the team we've been talking about all podcasts, right? The Suns could pass them. It's not crazy.
Yep.
They're only they're not. They're either right above them or a little bit below them. It's going to be going back and forth, and we'll see how long Davis is out. We don't totally know.
Yeah.
But if he's out for a prolonged period of time, they can lose a lot of games. I mean, they were on a 4-game losing streak when he initially went down, right? So I think that part's going to be huge. And again, as I said earlier, I don't really know if I want to be the 3 seed over the 4 seed, because I'd rather play Utah than the Clippers in round 2, much rather.
Yep.
So that's going to be interesting to see how teams jockey. I guess it wouldn't be a lot of teams. It would really just be the Suns, I guess, whether they, if they really try to push for that. I think they're going to push for as high of a seed as possible. Just that's what you do when you're a young team that's never made the playoffs before, right? They're not going to tank for seeding, I don't think.
Exactly.
But it's a really interesting thing, and I feel really bad for whoever the poor souls are who are the 5 seed if the Lakers are the 4 seed.
I mean, even 6, you get yourself into not being in the play-in tournament, and then you draw the Lakers in the first round. That's just horrible.
Oh God.
I don't know. Are we going to see teams jockey out of the 6th spot and put themselves in the play-in just so they don't have to play the Lakers?
Oh God. I mean, it's possible. The owners tend to default to they just want the revenue, right?
Yeah.
But God, man. I mean, that's such a good point you brought up. I haven't really thought much about. I thought about the Suns possibly passing them, but I haven't thought about them falling that far. But you're right, it's not crazy because any game 80 misses, they can lose.
Yep, and that I guess let's quickly talk about it. Obviously, we don't want to talk about Anthony Davis not playing for the rest of the season because that would be disastrous for his kind of long-term career if that's the case. So if he is playing, really my notes on it are their guards aren't great, and obviously they don't need to be when they've got Anthony Davis and LeBron, but I definitely think trying to think of how they neutralize our two All-Stars is quite an interesting conversation because as great as their two stars are defensively, it wouldn't be very realistic to think that either of those guys would be, playing straight up on Chris Paul and Devin Booker. So I guess there's the potential that one or two of our guys could really go off and keep us in the series. And even their wings are kind of behind LeBron and Anthony would kind of be exploitable, and it would kind of be a really big series for the likes of McHale, Cam Johnson. Like if we've got even a puncher's chance, like those guys would just have to be hitting everything from outside, and getting the best of all the opportunities that Booker and Chris Paul are creating for them.
Yeah, and I think Ayton would have to have a really good series just to kind of somewhat get in 80's way, right? Because if 80 runs ramshot over you, you don't have no chance.
Yeah. So
the Ayton would have to be like, the 4-game stretch focus Ayton for a full 7 games for that to work.
Yeah.
And I think, I'm not exactly, saying anything genius here, saying the two most important players long-term not to be really good, but also Booker, right? Booker is going to have to just be the guy at the end of the game who just wins you games because you're not going to blow the Lakers out 4 times. You're going to have to win close games. And, obviously Chris Paul could be there and doing some of that too, but ultimately, at the end of the day, it's got to be Booker, right? Booker's got to be the one who takes over the games at the end and has those games where he's just unstoppable and he just scores, 7 points in the last 2 minutes and wins the game. And Booker's very capable of that, and I think that you'd have to seal games like that to beat the Lakers.
Yeah, I'm 100% with you on that. And yeah, hopefully we're having another podcast around that time where we can go even more depth on it. But it just feels almost silly to talk about too much at this point in time, given it would be probably a Western Conference Finals matchup, or I guess we get unlucky and draw the Lakers in one of those first 2 rounds, Max.
Yeah, and it's funny to think about it. I just thought about, David, is the very last time the Suns were in the playoffs all those years ago, it was in the Western Conference Finals against the Lakers.
Yep.
So maybe that'll come back around in our next appearance. We'll see. I'll take it. Again, I'll take any Western Conference matchup you want to give me. You can merge the Brooklyn Nets and the Lakers together and we'll play against them. That's fine. I'll get swept. I just want to get there.
Hey, I said it in Did You Know? Gentleman sweep in the Western Conference Finals. I'll take it every day of the week.
Absolutely. All right. I think that is it for our playoff jinx session there, David. Should we go on to 7 seconds or less?
And lo and behold, we're right on that magic 1.5 hour mark, which we managed to do almost every time. But yeah, let's do 7 seconds or less to round things out here, Max.
Yep, we always hit it. So 7 seconds or less is the segment where nowadays both of us ask the other 3 questions for which the other has not prepared and only has 7 seconds or less to answer. David, do you want to go first or do you want me to go first?
I'll go first. I gave you a warning in Did You Know that 2 of my questions were going to be related to All-Stars this season and next season. I think you're going to need more than 7 seconds on this first one at least. So, which current All-Star from this season would be both achievable for the Suns and make them a legitimate contender with 3 All-Stars on the team if we traded for them, Max?
Okay, and you said it has to be realistic, right? Correct. Let me try to run through the teams here. So it's got to be a player on a team that's not very good. Because if they're really good, they're not going to be trading their star away, right?
Yeah, and the problem is, why it's a really hard question, is a lot of the guys that tick that box, are pretty duplicitous against, Chris Paul and Devin
Well, yeah, because Bradley Beal jumps out, right?
Exactly.
On a bad team. But, yeah, I don't know. I guess you can try playing those 3 guys together and just see what the hell happens. But I don't know if it would be the best fit of all time. While I'm stammering and looking at the All-Star rosters, David, do you have an answer for this one?
I don't. It's your question.
Yeah,
but I mean,
put it on you.
Bill does get to it. It obviously creates issues with the roster, and you would obviously be playing Beal or Booker at small forward. But I do think that is a crazy offensive lineup where you wouldn't maybe lose too much on defense if you structured things up properly in the starting 5. But yeah, that was kind of my one he's the most tradable for All-Star at the moment, I think, Max.
Yeah, going through it, the only other guys that I think would even maybe be tradable are Nikola Vucevic and Domantas Sabonis. But man, those guys don't really make sense on our team.
No.
Unless you're trading Ayton.
Yeah, but I guess to get an All-Star on this team, Ayton's probably going to be the core of the package, right?
Oh yeah, definitely. And we'll get to that in a second, David. But maybe Ben Simmons if things go crazy. I don't know. I think probably the answer is Beal, right? I mean, maybe they just say, hey, you know what? We don't care about the fit. We'll make it work. Let's go get Beal.
Yeah, and I think I just made the record for longest 7 seconds or less question ever. So give me yours.
Nice. It is a fun one. Mine are not going to be much easier, David. All right. So I mentioned the Zach Lowe, Bill Simmons podcast earlier. Something else that happened, Suns related to that podcast, they were talking about a Mikal Bridges extension. Mm-hmm. And Bill Simmons famously did not blink at a $100 million deal for Mikal Bridges. So let me ask you this. If both DeAndre Ayton and Mikal Bridges demand $100 million plus contracts to remain with the Suns, each one is actually threatening to sign his qualifying offer and leave the team if they don't receive that contract, do you sign both of them to those contracts, or do you only sign one, and if so, which one?
So I haven't got to that podcast yet, but I assume it's 4 years, 25, and that's the 100, right?
I think that's what they were talking about, yeah. And yeah, maybe you can assume that Ayton would be a little more than that, or 5 years or whatever, and yeah, Mikal would be 4 for 100.
Yep. So getting back to the heart of your question, do I sign both of them, or do I only sign one of them, basically, right?
Yep, and if only one of them, which one?
It's a bit of a cop-out, but I think I would sign both of them. And the reason that I would do that is I think at, say, 425, there's still a reasonable chance that that Ayton contract isn't disastrous. And if you need to get off it for future reasons, cap, whatever, I still think you could do it.
Yep, that makes sense. I think I agree with you on that one. Although, if it's a max contract, I may be rephrasing my answer to the question. Okay. Actually, no, I guess it's your turn, huh?
Yep, my second one. With little to no change to this roster, what is the ceiling for the playoffs with this team? I know we've basically just run through it the whole podcast, but if gun to your head right now, where are we landing at the end of the playoffs, Max?
You're talking about the absolute, the ceiling, the best case scenario, right?
Yep, and with no change. So this current core that we've got, what damage can they do in the playoffs?
I can't believe I'm saying this, David. They could win the title with this team. It's possible. I mean, of course, it would require like an injury to one of the LA teams or whatever, right? There would be luck involved. In fact, most title winners have luck, right? Usually. The Lakers didn't play anybody last year at all. The Raptors went up against a broken Warriors team. Like, a lot of title winners have luck. But, if we have perfect luck, this team is super talented, man. And if Ayton can play like the 4-game stretch, Ayton, the whole playoffs, and, Chris Paul and Booker are both amazing, like, why not, right?
Yeah, I'm with you. I think you're right. You've got to put that big caveat on it that's like, it's going to require a lot of luck. But you look at any championship run, there's luck involved. You can look back to the bubble with the Lakers even. The Heat knocked out the Bucks, who are probably a very good matchup for the Lakers in the finals, and then obviously had their injuries in the finals. And not to say that the Lakers didn't deserve their title, but they basically just walked over the Heat in the finals because there was just no one to play against, basically. So I think every title team has an element of luck. The Suns would need an absolute heap, but I think you're probably right on that one. And just I didn't touch on it before with your first question, but I don't blink at signing Mikal Bridges, just to make that very clear to everyone. It's the Ayton part of that question that made me kind of stumble a little bit there, Max.
Yeah, I agree. The $100 million figure does not scare me at all.
No.
Okay, next two are trade deadline related from me, David. The first is smallish move, the second a rather largest move. But not too small, though.
Okay.
So we talked about this guy a million times already on this podcast. I think I had him on my mind because of this question. Sam Presti's calling. George Hill, who's played pretty well for the season, but say even before the deadline, he looks even better. He's available and is being shopped. And a few teams, including some of Phoenix's Western Conference rivals, are offering late firsts for him. The Suns are pretty hamstrung by the CP3 trade from trading a first, as you know.
Yep.
They can trade this year, but they can't really trade much else. So say Presti, though. Presti just really likes Jalen Smith. He's a big Jalen Smith fan. He calls you. He says, hey, George Hill, I'll trade him to you for Jalen Smith and Javon Carter. That money works out. Would you do it? Straight up, Hill for Smith and Carter.
George Hill for Smith.
You're really putting on Smith. It's really, it's a future versus current season sort of thing.
Yeah, and I guess I'm not as tied to Jalen Smith for a couple of reasons. I didn't scout him heavily because I just didn't expect the Suns to take him. So I don't have this longer term view of how good Jalen Smith can be. I've got some thoughts, but I don't have a lot of confidence in those thoughts because I didn't really dig into his college tape too much. And I haven't loved what I've seen from him so far. Carter, I mean, kind of like my Mikal Bridges thing before. I do that in a heartbeat. There's no kind of holding on to Javon Carter for any reason. So you're right. It essentially comes down to trading a first for George Hill. I mean, a lot needs to happen in the next month, but in short, I've made this a very long answer, but yes, I would do it because it would signal that this team is basically saying we are fucking good, and this piece is actually gonna kind of take us to the next level. And like with the Chris Paul trade, throwing those extra assets in to make a move like that, I've just got no qualms with.
Yeah, CP3, we all hope he's going to last forever, but he's not going to last for 10 years, right? Your window's now. So I'd say
exactly.
Smith won't be good for a few years in all likelihood, so I'm all in on it too. All right, hit me with your last one, then I'll do my last one.
Yep, my second one that I alluded to in Did You Know, fast forward to next year, Max, Chris Paul and Devin Booker are both All-Stars again for the Phoenix Suns, which would be amazing, particularly for Chris Paul's legacy and health moving forward. It's kind of a duplicate of the first question, but you can throw other names in there. Which current or future Sun joins them to make it just the third trio of Suns to make the All-Star game, Max?
Jalen Smith. No, I was, it's a really good question. I mean, the most obvious answers are Mikal or Ayton, right?
Yeah.
And I think it's tough. I think I'll go with Mikal. I mean, he's been showing some flashes of off the bounce stuff, and if that just takes another level upwards, it's possible, especially if the Suns are the 1 seed. And they get that, hey, they're the 1 seed, and they deserve 3 All-Stars buzz, and maybe one who's a little weaker gets in there. But I guess I'll go with Mikal, but I mean, Ayton's the other option, obviously.
Yeah, I kind of put it at 50-50. I'm stronger on Mikal like you are, but I don't think Suns fans realize, or maybe they do, and I'm not giving everyone enough credit. It wouldn't actually be that much of a jump of things that Ayton would need to do to get in the All-Star conversation, and the bigs are probably easier to nudge yourself in there versus, say, what Mikal would be up against trying to become an All-Star with the current crop of All-Stars. So that's why it's kind of a 50-50 proposition for me, even though I kind of like Mikal's chances a little bit more, if that makes sense.
And I could easily see it being, X player they make a big trade for, too.
Yeah.
If they're trying to do something big. And on that note, David, is my last question for you.
Ooh, okay. Let's do it.
Minnesota's calling. Ooh. Towns has been saying all the right things publicly, but you got to know he wants the hell out of there. He's told them secretly he wants to go play with Devin Booker and Chris Paul in Phoenix. He wants to play with his buddy, and he thinks that's a real chance at a title for him. Now, Minnesota wants to avoid him going public with this. They prefer to do what the Jazz did with Darren Williams, remember 10 years ago, where they just kind of ninja'd out of nowhere, traded him?
I'm old enough to remember that. Yes, Max, thank you.
Yes, me too, unfortunately. But Minnesota knows that if they make him publicly available, they could probably just get absolutely paid by New Orleans or Oklahoma City or a team like that, right?
Yeah.
So they're not going to sell him on the cheap. So they come to you, they call you, they give you a take it or leave it offer here. Now, I'm not going to bore you with the details. It has to be a 3-team trade to make it work. I won't get into all that, but I'll just tell you what Phoenix gives up and gets, okay?
Okay.
Phoenix gets Towns and a cheap dude who makes the money work who sucks. Don't even worry about him. They give up DeAndre Ayton, Cam Johnson, Jalen Smith, Javon Carter, and Langston Galloway. In addition, they convert the CP3 pick to OKC, that all those protection stuff, to a fully unprotected pick in 2022, which would allow us to give Minnesota a 23 swap, 24 unprotected, 25 swap, and 26 unprotected. So we'd retain this year's pick, but we'd be giving away first potentially from 2022 through 2026, although a lot of those swaps probably won't convey because we'll be better than Minnesota. So the roster's going to be in this scenario: CP3, Booker, Mikal, Crowder, Towns, with a bench of Saric, Payne, Moore, Kaminsky, Nader. You got that, but you don't got a whole lot going forward because you gave away all your future. What say you, David?
I'm going to make up for my extremely long-winded questions and answers so far. Yes.
Yep. Yeah, you got to do it, right? I mean, Booker, CP3, and Towns can win the title, period.
I've got to bring some... I know I did really just want to end on yes, but I have to justify it a little bit, and I think you've kind of alluded to it there in the way that you phrased it.
Okay.
It's two things. The moment this team traded for Chris Paul, it was on the clock, essentially, in that you've got to make moves if you're close enough to vault them even further into playoffs consideration and doing damage in the playoffs. So from that perspective, box ticked. The second perspective, which I think is the underrated part of your question, is when Chris Paul leaves this team, whether it's the end of this year, the end of next year, whatever, the question and the conversation everyone will be having is then what is the future of the Phoenix Suns with Devin Booker? I don't feel confident right now. I don't hate Ayton, and I know people like to think that I do. I just don't. I just think he's, and I said it multiple times this week, is one of the most confusing Suns, if not the most confusing Suns player I've ever watched play for my team. And I also think that the conversation on Karl Anthony Towns, because of how much time he's missed and how much the Wolves suck, just sucks right now. I think his value amongst just general NBA fans is the lowest it's ever been, and I just think that's wrong. I think he showed that he's an absolute star when he's healthy and on the court, and the question mark of what the future of the team is beyond Chris Paul would also be answered, and that's why, in a very long-winded way, I would be totally fine with giving up that ridiculous haul of things that we just gave up to trade for Karl Anthony Towns.
You're right, because while you're trading away your draft future, you're actually kind of giving yourself a future, right, with the Towns Booker thing, because you know they love each other. It's a pretty perfect fit. Basketball-wise, you and Towns play a little better defensively, but the shooting from Towns and Booker together would be just ridiculous in offense. And then I let you keep Mikal too, which maybe made it too easy. Maybe it should have been Mikal instead of Cam Johnson.
Yeah, I think I was expecting you to throw in Mikal, but it just makes too much sense that if you can hold on to him, that you know that core is something to be really excited about going forward. So yeah, I mean, I guess anyone is going to easily just give up 4 picks instead of Mikal because you're far more attached to Mikal. But yeah, I think it would be an interesting yes or no if he was in there, because I think it does change things a little bit.
Be a lot harder because like Mikal helps you win with that team. You need the defense.
100%.
All right, well that is it, David, for us. It was fun. Do you have anything you want to plug with your newsletter?
No, just go subscribe to it if you're listening to this. If Max and I rejoining and sharing the pod on Twitter got you to my newsletter and you haven't been reading it, please give it a shot. I think I've been on a little bit of a roll recently, and it's enjoyable content and free content, so why not? But other than that, Max, I just hope this continues. This team keeps being fun and keeps dragging back us, I should say, onto the mics, because this is always a lot of fun, and I think we knew this pod discussion was going to be a lot of fun, and we are an hour and 45 in, and it has been very, very enjoyable. So thanks to you for bringing it to the table, Max.
Of course, and you as well. And yeah, if this team makes the playoffs like we're assuming they're going to do, I am sure we'll be back to discuss them then. Until then, thanks for listening, guys.